Joy Oliver, welcome to Weird Sauce, and thank you for making time to have a conversation with us from South Africa, I believe. Could you kindly introduce yourself for the audience?
Thank you so much, Florence. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you. So I'm Joy Olivier. I have always lived in South Africa. I was born in 1980 and grew up on a farm in a place called Thornville, which is so small that even people who live near Thornville have never heard of it. It's essentially a few farms, a petrol station, and a post office. And it was also the site of a lot of turmoil and unrest as I was growing up. So I grew up in one of South Africa's darkest times, in a place where some of the darkest things were happening. And so I think my childhood was a really strange mix of an idyllic time on a farm, eating strawberries that my dad grew, and playing with my sister and having freedom to ride our bikes wherever we wanted, while at the same time there was like really intense violence and unrest going on all around us. I was 14 years old when Mandela was released from prison. I think growing up and forming my ideas about the world at that time, I'm really grateful for that experience. I think it's given me quite a unique kind of perspective on things like how people view each other and treat each other and what they expect from each other. I went to school in Pietermaritzburg, which was like the local town, and then in second year university, I moved to go to the University of Cape Town, and that was like moving to the big city, which is quite sweet now because having had a lot of privilege to travel, like I can appreciate that Cape Town's actually a village. But when I moved here, it seemed like the most amazing, booming, exciting metropolis. And so my background is in psychology, in education. I worked as a researcher. I started, my first real job was working for the Human Sciences Research Council. And there I was tasked with looking at where is the next generation of scientists going to come from? Where is the next generation of health practitioners going to come from? And that drew me to looking at the maths and science results of the children in the country. And that was the first time I realized the intensity of the education crisis and the incredible inequalities. And that has really kind of set my path for the rest of my life, that mission to try and redress that injustice. My colleague and I at the HSRC established a nonprofit called Ikamva Youth that we worked on together for many years. I did that for 18 years and then handed over to the new leadership. Had a wonderful break doing a fellowship at Yale, which was amazing. And while I was there, I established a new social enterprise called Botanican, which is working in Lesotho, employing regenerative farming practices to grow medicinal cannabis and essentially heal both the planet and people through indigenous medicines. So I'm still working on inequality. I'm still trying to redress things. I'm still involved in research and writing and advocacy around education. The COVID crisis and school closures has pulled me very much back into that fight. But at the same time, I'm very grateful that I get a chance to go and be on the farm and be away from my computer and grow things, which I'm doing with my dad and with the very amazing people that live on the farm there. And that's a very nice addition to my life, for which I'm very grateful.
So you mentioned health and inequality as big subjects. in and of themselves, even if we don't look at education as of now, these are very large subjects. So why health? Inequality, I sort of understand, given the trajectory you just described. Why health? Why did you take an interest in health specifically?
I think health and education are essentially the two things that everybody needs to have a fair chance. And we can't fight inequality without ensuring that people have access to healthcare and to education. I think health is something that's easy to take for granted when you have it. And I had a health scare when I was 25, which really helped me to focus on my purpose and to be brave about the things that I wanted to do and to make decisions that people at the time thought was a bit mad. But in retrospect, I think everyone can agree that it was a good thing that I made those decisions. So I think, I think the quality of our lives is very much determined by the health that we experience and the opportunities we have to use our minds. And those are two things that I feel very privileged to have myself and very committed to do as much as I can to ensure that as many other people have them too as possible.
So whether you, I'm going to ask you whether you want to go into a little bit more detail about what that healthcare was, because I'm obviously privy to it, but I'm not sure whether you're comfortable talking to people broadly about how serious it was and how significant it could have really been. I mean, it was significant, but if you're not comfortable, fully understand, we'll move on. But it would be quite interesting, I think, for people to understand at such a young age that you had such a significant health challenge and how you dealt with it.
So when I was 25 years old, I was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. I had a wart / mole on my leg that 2 doctors had said was, just a wart. And then when I went, and it just kept growing. And then by the time I got to the 3rd doctor, he totally freaked out and asked me to leave the room, but I could hear him speaking on the phone to his colleague, and they were just trying to get me into surgery as soon as possible. That was pretty surreal. It was especially surreal. I remember the moment sitting at his desk and he was showing me a graph of life expectancy with the different stages of cancer. And, being a researcher, I look at graphs all day. And it took me a while to understand what the graph was saying, because it was essentially saying that I probably most likely had about 2 years left to live, which, it's an amazing experience. It's both terrifying, obviously, but also really makes you feel alive. So the contradiction of that news is so interesting, and I think I've been so lucky. I mean, it all worked out really well. I had surgery; they managed to get it all out. It hadn't spread into my lymph system, and so it was. I kind of defied the odds. Everybody was really surprised. They couldn't believe that it hadn't spread, and I was just extremely lucky. So I had a really profound experience around, just how mortal we are and how limited our time here is. Without all the hardship that most people who have cancer have to deal with, like I didn't have to have any chemo, I wasn't in pain, besides post-surgery recovery, there wasn't, I really got off easy. And so, so I don't, in that way, I don't, call myself a cancer survivor, because I don't feel like I had to actually survive what cancer usually entails for most people. But I am very grateful for that moment and the 2 weeks that I had waiting between when I was told that I had 2 years left and when I was told that actually I would probably be fine. That was really a gift, because I was really young. I was at the beginning of my career, and I had started a project that I was doing in my spare time as a volunteer. And that recognition of just how short the time is that we have gave me the courage to leave my full-time research job and to throw myself into doing something for which, I didn't have any funding, I didn't have a network. I was really just trying to build something with my friends. And yeah, I don't think I would have made that decision without the health scare. I think I would have kept living a safer life with a salary and, climbing a research career ladder. And so, yeah, my health stuff has been, it's been ongoing. I had to have tests every 3 months, and then every 6 months, and then every year, and then a decade passed, and my doctor said, you're done. Congratulations, you don't have to keep coming for tests. And then a year later, I got another lump in my leg, and so early 2020, I get 2020 and 2019 mixed up, but it was just before COVID hit, so it was February 2020. I was another melanoma was identified, but again, I was lucky it was cut out, and I didn't have any pain. I recovered incredibly quickly, and so it feels like my body keeps reminding me about why I'm here, and how short the time is that I have, and what's interesting is what happened to me at 25. I mean, it's true for all of us, right? It's true that our time here is limited, and yet so often we get distracted by things that we think matter when they're really not actually important in the grand scheme of things.
So, Joy, you mentioned something very essential there with this reminder of our clock, our inherent clock for all of us. Of course, the concept of death, but of course, it was faced with an acute timeline for you and for many people who are ill. But I'm just wondering, what do you think happened in this rebound moment where you got more time than you thought you would have? And then your quest for, was it meaning? Was it something that would make a difference? So I'm very curious about what were you looking for? And then therefore, what did you find?
So I'm not sure that I was looking. It was almost as though I was called. And I'm not a religious person, so I don't, I maybe more have a kind of philosophical view on spirituality, but I think that there are things that we think and do, and that really speak to us, that feel like this is right for me. This is my space. This is my flow. This is why I'm here. I think society, history, all of these things, inform us and take us off those paths. But I do believe that essentially we all have that inside us. And so I think the health scare helped me to connect with that more deeply. I didn't set about with any particular intention. It kind of just happened.
And so the proximity to the subject of education, was it the sense of their large social gap, and education is one way to fill this gap? Or was it actually always about education first and then the social gap behind? Because I think South Africa is, like all country, it has unique sets of challenges. And maybe you want to talk about that a little bit more so that people understand who are not familiar with South African scenario.
Sure. I think I'm a learner. I love learning. That's my passion. I read all the time. And I'm really grateful to the education for the education that I received. So I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and as a result, the life that I'm living is very different to the life that I grew up in. And so I really know from a personal experience just what a passport education can be into different lives, into different worlds, into different ideas. And so that link between education and freedom, whether it's freedom of mind or economic freedom, all of these things have, it's really intrinsically linked for me. And then I think growing up in South Africa with such extreme inequality, and also growing up on a farm during apartheid, it's a very loaded and complicated history, where essentially the systemic injustice and racism was so structurally embedded that there's just no, being a white person from South Africa means that you have because others do not, and especially so when I was growing up. So the education that I got was because others were not getting educated. And so with that comes a responsibility to pay forward what it is that we received, and to try and make things, to try and redress that inequality and that injustice. So it was always about education for me. It's always been about learning. I started Ecom for Youth before the cancer scare, while I was doing the research at the Science Council. And a few things happened all at the same time. So we had been, Ecom for Youth is an after-school tutoring and mentoring program, working with high school learners in the hours after school, helping them with their homework and career guidance and computer literacy, and essentially doing what it is that middle-class parents do for their children to help them to progress in school and to ultimately access post-school opportunities, whether it's higher education or employment. And we had been going for, so we started in 2003. 2005, the year that I was diagnosed, was also our first year of having matrics, which is grade 12, the final year of high school in South Africa. So these amazing people that we were working with, and I mean, I wasn't very much older than them. I was 23 years old at the time. They wrote their final exams and got amazing results, like really amazing results, way better than any of us were expecting, and certainly way better than the trajectory given how their peers at their schools were doing. So that was incredibly exciting. And then the real turning point was when they said to one of the other tutors, one of my friends, they said, thank you so much for everything that you've done for us, and how can we repay you? And she said, well, come and tutor. And so they did. And that's really how the Ecom for Youth model kind of developed itself. And it was just so inspiring to me, when seeing that happen, seeing essentially like people's lives changing so miraculously, going from, some of these children, when I met them, didn't have 20 cents for a photocopy, and now they were going into like the top institutions to study physics, and with full scholarships. And just seeing that radical shift was so inspiring. And then for them to say, we want to come back and tutor and help other children to achieve the same things, that was very inspiring, and it felt way bigger than me or any of us, and it felt like a huge privilege to be part of it. And so at the same time, my research job was really frustrating, and I was getting frustrated with development aid and the politics, and it just felt like being on the ground, doing something with real people that was actually working was a gift to be a part of, more than any kind of career move. In fact, my family were really worried about my career, and my aunties would call and say, when are you going to get a real job? And it was hard, and that's when we met Florence, and you saw me in that a few years later. But it's now become one of the biggest nonprofits in South Africa, serving young people. Thousands of young people have transitioned from school into education and employment. The income gap, the racial income gap, has been closed for most of them. And it's just, I feel like eCamphor showed me that some of the most contractable problems are actually solvable. And I learned so much from being part of that. And I'm still learning about it, because we don't really understand how it is that people learn. We don't understand what it is that makes someone able to achieve academically and for somebody else not to. And my sense is that so much of it comes down to relationships between people. And we all need someone who believes in us, and we all need someone who has high expectations about what it is that we can achieve. And I think there's magic in that. Maybe that's the weird source of education. It's so difficult to find a randomized control trial that proves that that's the thing. But after 2 decades of working in education and trying to redress those inequalities and solve those problems, and trying all different ways, whether it's EdTech or this program or that program, I feel like ultimately learning comes down to the relationships between people. And so I think I can't even remember the question. I really went on a tangent there.
Not that much of a tangent. The thing that I'm really curious about is you have this amazing NGO that is now the size that it is, and then you went off to Yale. So you have basically two experiences of two ways of dealing with education. A large scale problem is the same, it's educating people. And then you've got the experience of being on the one side, which is you put it together, as you said, with the way that you did. And then you go and experience the real big institution in education, higher ed, the things with big names, the things that basically almost every child in the world that is aware of it wants to have a piece of, but obviously very few will. And so what was your experience of seeing this dichotomy of system between two education system, what the best of America has to offer, and the higher ed, that's a name that's respected all around the world, and what you had achieved already and you knew was achievable on the ground with no name? You made the name. You want a Yale. You've become a Yale now, perhaps, but you want Yale then. So I'm very curious about what it felt like to move to the other side of the bridge.
Honestly, it felt like a dream. And my sister reminded me that we used to play games when we were children, and we used to pretend that we were going to go study at Yale. So it was really that kind of far away as a dream. I mean, we didn't grow up traveling. We didn't go overseas, so I still can't actually believe that I went there, and it really was quite surreal. I mean, it was an amazing experience. We got so I was part of the Yale World Fellows program, where every year people from all over the world are selected to be part of a class who then get to go to Yale for a semester, connect with each other, learn about each other's countries and each other's work, and then also to interact with the faculty and the students at Yale. And we were really so welcomed. It was, I mean, the difference between being at Yale and the kinds of experiences that most university students in South Africa experience was just the disparity was just unbelievable. So at the same time that I was going to Yale, we were having protests around fees must fall, with university students in South Africa fighting for accessibility to higher education, essentially. And really, really tough stories of students who just didn't have enough transport money to get to campus. People who are hungry on campus because they can't afford food. And these are real realities that are happening right now with university students in South Africa. And then at Yale, outside each beautiful classroom is a massive spread that just gets left. And it's just the abundance and the the huge privilege. I mean, I remember walking around there because they gave us medical aid, they gave us housing, I could take my family, we had, everything that you could wish for. And I distinctly remember the feeling walking down those beautiful leafy avenues and feeling like the air is different. It's just so safe, it's so comfortable, it's so privileged, it's very yeah, it's the word is escaping me, but it's very sorry, I can't think of the word, but ultimately it's a completely different world, like could not be more different. And it comes down again to privilege and access, because the students at Yale are extremely smart and inspiring and brilliant, and they're there because they're privileged for the most part. And it really drains me to think about the talent that we're wasting, in terms of the human potential on the planet and the number of brilliant people who are just not getting a chance to learn how to read or to be numerate or to use their minds in the way that their minds can be used. And because we're only giving a certain type of people access to that, we are really limiting our potential for innovation, for solving problems, because privilege is ultimately a blind spot. And the more privileged we are, the less in the real world we live. We really just live in a bubble. And yet it's the privileged people who are deciding what money gets spent, where money flows, what policies are passed or written, or, we're the decision makers, deciding things on behalf of all the people on the planet, and yet we don't know what it's like to live like most of the people on the planet are living. And so, yeah, it just feels like we're really losing an opportunity by not expanding those educational opportunities to more and different kinds of people.
So, in terms of inequalities, you just talk about the chasm that education has, and I think we can make the same point with healthcare and the fact that healthcare inequality has just been exemplified by the pandemic, can be huge and obviously make a difference between life and death. So, in your experience of 2020 begins, SARS-CoV-2 comes around. I don't know how quickly it came to be a mega problem to daily functioning in South Africa. It came fairly quickly in the West after China. So I'm wondering, how have you seen 2020 and 2021 upend or change all this knowledge that you had about already a very strained system in education? And what, in your view, has this actually changed for the better or for the worst?
So I feel like I'm still trying to really understand all the implications that COVID has brought for us. I find myself being drawn to reading science fiction with dystopian plots, because there's just so much that's difficult to wrap my head around. And it feels like a lot of the sci-fi written in the late 80s and 90s is, set in today, and it's kind of frightening how bang on a lot of it is. I've always known that climate change is going to wreck normality. And so I've always kind of been expecting that. I think, and I've always had a sense that I would see that and experience that in my lifetime, just given what science is telling us, and what's happening. But if someone had told me in 2018 that we would all be wearing face masks and unable to leave our houses, it just sounds like a science fiction plot. So what changed is this idea that was a real understanding and experience that we really don't know what's going to happen. And this idea of safety and security and reliability and predictability are all stories that we tell ourselves. And really, the more privileged we are, the more we can tell ourselves that story. But I think that this really helped us to know that we don't know what's happening. And then I think COVID has really brought out the best and the worst in humans. It's devastating to me how greedy and selfish and self-serving and also kind of idiotic a lot of the responses have been. It's the state of global politics is just devastating. The polarization of people. It feels like we've gone backwards in a lot of ways. But then also people have been amazing, so on the ground in terms of responding to trying to meet needs, I do feel like crises can be opportunities. And certainly in the work that I do in education, we're very much taking the approach of let's not lose a good crisis, because the reality is that before the schools were closed, we had a crisis. Before we had those learning losses, we were in crisis. But it was normalized. And so it was normalized that children from privilege would learn how to do maths, and children who aren't, very few of them will gain those skills. And in a way, the school closures have provided an opportunity for new approaches and deeper collaboration between different stakeholders. So before COVID, the state would often get defensive. When we talk about the education crisis, it feels, people from the Ministry of Education and government departments feel like we're telling them that they're not doing a good enough job, right? What COVID shifted is, first of all, COVID is no one's fault. We can all agree and appreciate and be on the same page that this is a problem that's way bigger than any of us, and that we all have to work together to try and resolve things. It also helped really bring home the importance of home environments for learning. I think there's been a crazy expectation on this schooling system that it can somehow make up for all the socioeconomic ills in the country. And that's just a really unfair and unrealistic expectation. I think COVID has really helped us to see the difference in opportunity that children have in terms of learning, depending on the kinds of home environments that they come from. Whether it's access to electricity, access to ed tech, psychosocial support, a place to do homework, food to eat. The hunger situation in South Africa is horrific. We have 600,000 children are hungry every day in this country, and COVID really, COVID has really taken South Africa into needing humanitarian responses. As I said, I'm reading sci-fi because it's the only way that I can kind of make sense of what's happening. Things have gotten so bad. But in the crisis, it feels like this is something that we can't deny. We can't, because it's before COVID, it was normal that there's this crazy inequality. Now with COVID, it feels like people are waking up to the extent of the inequality in a way that they were asleep to before. And I'm hoping that continues. And I'm hoping that the experience that privileged people have had in this pandemic, where they suddenly realize that the ground under our feet is not as stable as we thought, that gives a tiny little inkling into what it's like to be living in a less advantaged situation, where every day is like that for most people. And And I'm hoping that that increases our empathy, our compassion, and also just the logic that if the haves take everything at the expense of the have-nots, it is not a sustainable solution, whether we're talking about the soil and the air or human capital or just humanity.
And so, what's the situation now? 20 months into it, have you returned to school? Are schools back to being open? What is the momentum there?
I'm extremely concerned about the current situation in South Africa, and I think what's concerning me most is that it's so bad that people are really not paying attention to it. So what's happened is that schools are officially back and all middle-class children are back learning. They haven't really missed out on too much. Low and no fee schools, which is where 70% of the country's children attend, have been given an option to apply for exemption for returning back. Now, this is a very new thing that's just happened. The data is not publicly available yet on how many schools. However, I do know from inside sources that in the province where I live, in the Western Cape, 80% of those low and no fee schools are not returning back to full-time classes. And so they're doing what's called platooning, where the children come on alternate days. So they're ending up getting half as educated as they were before. And we've got really good research that's already looked into the learning losses and shown that we've essentially lost a decade in the last 2 years. And the fact that this is continuing is just horrific to fathom. Because it's happening now, it's and no one seems to really care, because all the people who decide their children are back at school, it really feels like in South Africa, when something affects the middle class, it's a crisis. And when something's affecting everybody else, it's just normal and how things are. And I guess that comes from our history. So I'm very worried. I'm still hopeful that we can find a way to bring in other players in the ecosystem of education. I think there was a lot about the system that wasn't working before. Maybe sometimes things have to really break before you can build it back better. It's certainly broken now. And we have a common enemy, which is COVID, and a reason for it to being so broken. And so I am hopeful, but at the same time, I'm very frustrated, because the reality is that we need significant resources to address this. And there are many amazing organizations that are well positioned to work with schools, to work with families, to try and fill these gaps. And many of them could probably do a better job than just a normal classroom schooling situation. However, they really need funding, and the reality is they're all donor funded. That's not sustainable, it's not scalable. There's no business model for ensuring that poor children get educated, which really doesn't make sense, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive the whole economy's well-being. And so it's very frustrating to me that humans we're so short-term, we're so self-involved, and we don't realize how connected we are. I mean, if COVID has taught us anything, it's surely that the well-being of others impacts directly our own well-being, and vice versa. And maybe that's what my cancer scare taught me, is that we're all connected, and the well-being of others influences my own well-being. And the more that I do to help others to be well, the more well I am.
So, talking about this, what are your views on the vaccine rollout? And it seems that in the West, we have not only enough vaccine for the population, but we have enough vaccine for third dose and fourth dose and so on. What are your views about this evident inequality of distribution of vaccine at this stage?
I don't understand it. I don't understand how we stockpile vaccines until they're almost past their, they've almost reached their expiration dates, and then quickly ship them over to another place. It says something quite sad and sick about humans, I think, that we're so afraid, to the point that our fear will override our intelligence.
Well, I think the past 20 months is enough data in there, and I'm sure history will look at it and just wonder how, for the first time ever, we've done multiple interactions with no basis in terms of evidence, and we seem to continue to be doing that, certainly for the vaccine distribution, as a pandemic would demand that we spread that around the world, because nobody will be quote unquote safe until pretty much everybody is safe. So it escapes me as to what's the logic there as well. But so tell us about your new project, because that's also has to do with health and with growing things. And you mentioned in the introduction sustainability. So tell us more about that.
So another part of my cancer journey has been using cannabis, both for dealing with anxiety, which just comes with healthcare scares, and I think modern living. I think we're all anxious, and I found a paper that spoke specifically to a kind of so. I've become a total cannabis geek. It's very exciting to learn about all the different powerful potentials of the different parts of this plant. And I sent a paper to my doctor, which had found that cannabis with a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC can really stop the migration of melanoma cells. He said I should keep doing what I'm doing after he read that paper. I think cannabis is one of these interesting opportunities where it's not just one medicine, it's a whole pharmacy. The plant has got so many different cannabinoids in it that can do so many different things, and the combinations of those things can treat so many ailments. And yet we don't know a lot about it, because the last few decades research has just been stalled and stopped. And a lot of the history around that comes down to strange things like racism and trying to put people in jail. It's the history of the plant is fascinating and strange, and now slowly markets are opening up and different countries are legalizing to different extents. I've grown up with access to rural South Africa all my life, and it's always been very surprising to me that people living in extreme poverty are also growing such high quality cannabis in Africa. Having spent some time in the US and seeing how access to those medicines has been opening up, and the prices that dispensaries were charging, I was like, this is a no-brainer. If the Gogos in the rural Transkei can sell their cannabis to the people on the streets of Colorado, there's a massive opportunity for poverty alleviation. And so I've always been intrigued by that potential. In 2018, while I was at Yale, Lesotho legalized cannabis with some of the most progressive legislation in the world. And I'd been thinking about a cannabis project. There was also murmurings of South Africa opening up. Having worked with urban youth and working on education and poverty alleviation, I was really drawn to doing something in rural areas, not only for or like with the people who live in those areas, but also for myself, because I've really found that the more time I spend in nature, the more healing, the more healed I feel. And there's definitely a very strong pull and call for me to spend as much time in nature as I can. My dad is also a farmer, and so it felt like a really great opportunity to do a family business. And so while at Yale, I worked on a business plan for a social enterprise, looking at how we could make the most of this new opportunity with the new legislation. I was also drawn to a for-profit enterprise because of my frustrations with having run a nonprofit, where because we were reliant on donor funding, you're really just reliant on the whims of donors. And so there's a limit to how much you can scale. So even though the organization produces the most amazing results year on year for over a decade, it's still a struggle every year to make sure that there's enough money to do the budget. And although there's massive capacity for scale, there's a constraint in the business model. So I wanted to do something that essentially creates its own funding so that we can do social justice work, but without having to be reliant on donors. And so with the cannabis industry opening up and being brand new, it felt like a very exciting opportunity, especially because Lesotho is uniquely gifted in that it has a very high altitude, very rich soils, plenty sunlight. It's the perfect conditions for growing cannabis, and that's why some of the best cannabis in the world comes from there. So so while I was at Yale, I started working on the business plan, got connected with others that wanted to support, and I'm also part of another fellowship, the African Leadership Initiative, where we are really pushed to set up social ventures. And so I was really, really lucky to be connected with another fellow in my class who helped me to set up the business, and some of our other classmates have also been our main investors. And so it's very much a group effort of looking to see how to take this opportunity of a new industry in a place like it's literally the most unequal place in the world. People are still living the same way that they did hundreds of years ago. The poverty, the HIV/AIDS, the hunger, there's a lot of need. And what we're really hoping is that we can build a company that creates money that can then be spent on redressing those needs. So 20% of the company's profits are going to be directed into local infrastructure, health, and education projects, which I'm very excited and looking forward to the time when we do actually start to make some profit. It's been very slow and long and hard with border closures and the complexities of being a startup. So breaking even is still a long way off, never mind making profits, but I do think that we're going to get there, and I really can't wait to be able to invest in bringing really high quality education and healthcare to the people who are growing this amazing medicine with us. The other piece that I find fascinating is just looking at the soil and regenerative farming practices, and looking at ways of growing what it is that we need in ways that actually feed the environment. Cannabis absorbs huge amounts of CO2. It's more effective than forests. The opportunities for environmental contributions and redressing climate change are huge. And so learning about all of that is also very compelling. So it feels like this project is speaking to me and all the things that make me tick. There's a lot to learn. It's fascinating. There's very limited research, and it feels like a new field. And yet it's also a very ancient one. And so there's a lot of wisdom to draw on. It's an adventure. It's oftentimes frustrating, sometimes a little scary. COVID really knocked the business. The borders were closed. We couldn't plant for a season. Obviously cash flow. I think every company in the world has had cash flow issues. So it's been really tough. However, again, in the same way that happened with eCanva, it's the people that I'm working with that really are inspiring me. We couldn't pay rent to the chief. We didn't have enough funds. He said, keep going. You don't need to pay me. I really want to have shares in the company. And so we've got, we've found ways. We've had locals come and lend us their irrigation systems, people volunteering to work for free. It's very much a community project, and it feels like a real gift to be part of that. I think it brings me back to the thing that I said about education and relationships between people, ultimately being what it is that that makes life meaningful. And it's relationships between people working on a common goal to achieve good that can really change things.
So in terms of the use, so what's your vision for the use of the product? Because I'm sure you're aware of the controversy around toxicity, neurotoxicity of this product being used as a recreation as opposed to medicinal, which very different contexts. So what is your vision on that, on the use of the product that you're going to put in the market?
So the product that we have created is a CBDA product. It comes in oil and capsules, and it's very low on THC. So it's essentially a hemp product. So there's no risk of any psychoactivity. I think going forward, there's a lot of opportunity to make medicines with those other cannabinoids, and we'll certainly explore those. However, our commitment is to do this as safely as possible. And, putting something out into the world that could potentially harm someone is a terrifying thought. And so, I'm glad that I don't have to deal with that part of things just yet, because we've started really at the beginning, which is a hemp product. There's less than 0.2% THC in it, and so it doesn't have the kinds of risks that other higher THC medicines would have. The medicine that we've made essentially helps with anti-inflammatory, with nausea, with anticipatory nausea, and anxiety. But it doesn't have any side effects. So there's no risk to using it. I do think there's potential for making medicines to deal with more difficult ailments, for mental illnesses, psychological illnesses, and then also for pain. But I think the research still has quite a long way to go in those regards, and we would need to work with the regulators, get our medicines regulated, and we would only sell them in countries where things are carefully regulated.
Understood. So to conclude this conversation, which took us to many different areas of your life, and I can see that after so many years knowing you, you've taken again the idea of starting with a large problem that seems intractable and turning it on its head and trying to find a solution to it from the most originally inconceivable position. And so now I can see that you're trying that as well with your new endeavor, which is great. So to conclude, I would like to ask you what I ask all my guests, which is, having such a rich life as you've had so far, and I'm sure the rest will be just as representative of the previous years. What is the weird sauce that you've made for yourself that you could share, like a bottle of hope to the world that is so pained right now and so broken, it seems, so that it may inspire somebody somewhere listening to our conversation to try that ingredient or these ingredients in your weird sauce?
My weird sauce is the quality of my relationships. I feel like that's really where wealth sits, and I feel like I'm one of the richest people in the world because I'm so blessed to have such caring and amazing friends and family members and colleagues. And I think it's those relationships that make us brave for whatever it is that we want to do in the world. And I think it's the feeling of being able to be vulnerable, of feeling alone, of feeling stressed, of feeling scared, to share those feelings with other people. I think we all feel those feelings, and yet we're all pretending that we don't, or we feel like there's something wrong with us because we're feeling that way. But that is the human condition. And as soon as we open up and are vulnerable about those things with each other, it connects us and it heals us. And I guess my secret sauce is that it's love, it's friendship, and it's also fun. I think I prioritize fun, and it certainly helps to make things lighter. It gives me energy. It gives me perspective. I can get really bogged down, especially with the work that I do. It's often incredibly depressing and sad and frustrating, and it makes me angry. And I think it's good that I feel those things because those are appropriate responses to how things are. But at the same time, to be angry and depressed all the time is not going to help anybody. And so it's really through having fun with my friends that I'm able to get the energy back that I need to do the work that I do.
Joy, thank you very much for your time and sharing all the things you've shared. We wish you all the best for 2021 and, of course, upcoming 2022. Hopefully a less broken world, a better time for you and your new endeavor, and all the success that you deserve. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Florence. This has been a lot of fun, and it's so great to chat with you again.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.